Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be walking you through our AQA A-Level Psychology Paper 2, the predicted paper that we've written for 2024. So what I want you to pay attention to in this paper is how the answers are structured. So the balance of A1, the balance of A2 and the balance of A3, and then you can clearly see what sort of things, how you structure answers in an exam.
Strong evaluation skills are essential, so let's have a look at this structured approach to writing evaluation points. Firstly, begin by giving a point. Begin with a succinct and clear statement of the identified strength or limitation. For instance, if you're focusing on a strength, highlight a positive aspect of the topic. If it's a limitation, pinpoint an area of concern. You should then explain. Following the initial point, dig into the specifics. Offer a detailed explanation of why the identified point is a strength or limitation. This is the crux of your analysis, providing the necessary context and depth. Finally, offer a consequence. Conclude the paragraph by exploring the consequences of the identified strength or limitation. This involves discussing the impact on the overall quality or reliability of the work, drawing connections between the specific point and its broader implications. Let's now look at a model evaluation paragraph together. Zimbardo's research is, however, criticised for overestimating the levels of conformity. The paragraph begins by presenting a clear and concise point, asserting that Zimbardo's research is criticised for overestimating levels of conformity. This establishes the focus of the analysis and guides the reader toward the specific aspect under consideration. From 1973 highlights that only a third of participants exhibited violent and brutal behaviours, suggesting that the extent of conformity might have been exaggerated. Most of the participants were able to resist conforming to the social roles they were assigned. The rest of the guards were supportive of the prisoners and attempted to treat them in a supportive way. Following the initial point, the paragraph delves into a detailed explanation provided by From 1973. The explanation highlights that only a third of the participants exhibited violent and brutal behaviours, implying that the extent of conformity in Zimbardo's study might have been exaggerated. The paragraph provides specific information regarding the behaviour of the participants, offering an understanding of the criticism. This challenges the external validity of the study, raising concerns about its ability to accurately reflect real-world scenarios when not everyone may conform to extreme social roles. The paragraph proceeds to discuss the consequences of the identified limitation. It emphasises that most participants resisted conforming to the assigned social roles, and some guards even showed supportive behaviour towards the prisoners. This not only challenges the external validity of Zimbardo's study, but also raises concerns about its ability to accurately reflect real-world scenarios. By exploring the consequences, the paragraph goes beyond pointing out a limitation to underscore its broader implications for the study's validity and applicability. The paragraph effectively uses the point-explain-consequence structure by presenting a clear criticism point, supporting it with specific evidence and context, explain, and discussing the broader implications for the study's validity, consequence. The use of From's critique adds depth to the evaluation, providing a counter-perspective to Zimbardo's findings. The paragraph structure enhances the clarity and coherence of the evaluation, guiding the reader through a well-organised evaluation of the research on conformity. Section A, Approaches in Psychology. Answer all questions in this section. There are 24 marks available, and in the exam you should spend around 30 minutes completing this section. Remember that research methods can be examined in all parts of the paper. Outline one difference between cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. There are 2 marks available for the question. To secure both of these marks, the mark scheme says that response must be concise and well structured, and additional details should be provided. Because it is an outline question, we know that brief statements and sentences will be enough, as long as the information is thorough and accurate. The question is looking for a difference between cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, and therefore it isn't enough simply to give definitions of these concepts. We need to be looking at a difference between the two. So a feature or a characteristic needs to be selected, and then we need to compare this across the two domains. Let's take a look at this model response. One key difference between cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience is the areas of research that they focus on. Cognitive psychology examines mental processes such as perception and memory, whereas cognitive neuroscience looks deeper at the brain structures and neural mechanisms that are associated with these processes. This response is effective because it clearly identifies the difference between cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience in the first sentence. It highlights their respective areas of focus. It identifies a really clear difference between the two. This point is then explained in the second sentence, and it goes on to explain what the difference in the areas of study is. The explanation provides clarity by elaborating on how cognitive psychology examines mental processes, while cognitive neuroscience explores the underlying brain structures and neural mechanisms. It's clearly focused on what the two domains study. By mentioning specific examples of areas of study, such as perception and memory, and then the brain structures and neural processes, the response strengthens its explanation and helps to illustrate further the distinction between the two fields. Giving these examples of areas of study also contributes towards that additional detail that the mark scheme is asking for. It's this explanation and expansion of the initial point that ensures that the second mark is secured by providing those additional details. Outline one limitation of introspection. There are 2 marks available for the question. We can see from the mark scheme here that it says to secure both of these marks, the outline should focus on a limitation and that detail should be provided. We know because it is an outline question that brief statements and sentences will be enough as long as that information is accurate and it does provide some additional detail. We should note in the question that it is just looking for one limitation, so presenting multiple limitations wouldn't gain any further marks. Equally, it is just looking for a limitation, so there is no need to present an evaluation or present any information on the strengths of introspection. Here is the model response. One problem with introspection is that it is hard to replicate. Some internal experiences may be challenging to express verbally, and individuals may struggle to articulate subtle emotions, sensations, or thoughts accurately. This makes it difficult to replicate the exact introspective process that individuals use to report their findings. This response effectively addresses the question by first identifying a limitation of introspection. It does this by stating that it is difficult to replicate. The explanation in the second sentence elaborates on this limitation by pointing out challenges related to articulating internal experiences verbally and accurately expressing subtle emotions, sensations, or thoughts. This shows a strong knowledge of the introspection process and the problems that can arise. By highlighting these issues, the response provides a clear understanding of why introspection may be limited in its replicability, making it a strong response to the question and why it achieves the full 2 marks. A person's long-term relationship ended 6 months ago. They had to move into a new house in a different area, and it has been challenging keeping in contact with some of their friends. Using Maslow's hierarchy of needs, explain why this individual is struggling to achieve self-actualization. There are 4 marks available for the question. Looking at the mark scheme here, we can see that to achieve in the top mark band, so to achieve 3 or 4 marks, there should be a clear understanding of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This should be clear throughout the response and should be well explained. Therefore, we need to include reference to the different stages and different levels within the hierarchy. It then says that application to the scenario should be strong and in-depth. So we need to make sure that the information that's being presented about the hierarchy is then linked straight away to the situation given in the scenario. The answer should be cohesive, so there should be a clear structure, and technical language should be used consistently throughout the response and always in an accurate and an appropriate way. We should also note from the question that it is asking why the individual is struggling to achieve self-actualisation, so not just where they sit currently in the hierarchy. We may consider different levels in the hierarchy, but this needs to be linked very clearly to how that is stopping them from reaching the self-actualisation stage. Let's take a look at this model response. They have experienced significant changes, including moving to a new house, and potentially facing challenges in meeting their basic physiological needs, such as food, shelter, and safety in the new environment. Their focus is likely directed towards addressing these immediate concerns, rather than focusing on self-actualisation. They have also experienced disruption in terms of security and stability. Establishing a new home in a different area could create feelings of insecurity, as they do not know the area and what it is like. This will mean their safety needs are not being met either. As a result of the relationship breakdown, they may be dealing with a decline in self-esteem. The end of a long-term relationship can reduce esteem and confidence because someone has decided that you are no longer the type of person that they want to be with. This would mean that their esteem and love needs are no longer being met either. Given these challenges in the lower levels of the hierarchy, they may find it difficult to focus on self-actualisation needs. It is only when the needs lower down the hierarchy have been met that someone can then progress to self-actualisation. The response effectively uses Maslow's hierarchy of needs to explain why the individual is struggling to achieve self-actualisation. By addressing different levels of the hierarchy, it provides a comprehensive analysis of the situation. It doesn't just use one example of the hierarchy, but presents 3 different ideas. The answer begins by discussing how the individual's basic physiological needs, such as food, shelter, and safety, may be compromised due to the significant changes they've experienced, like moving to a new house. This addresses the lowest of Maslow's hierarchy, emphasising the importance of meeting these needs before higher level needs can be fulfilled. For example, basic physiological needs and safety needs are examples of the technical language used within Maslow's hierarchy. By including these terms in the response, it demonstrates good knowledge of this. The response explores the disruption in security and stability caused by relocation, affecting the individual's sense of safety and fulfilment of their security needs. It gives a clear reason as to why the person may not feel safe, the lack of knowledge of the new area. This application to the scenario is key here. It finally acknowledges the impact of the relationship ending on the individual's self-esteem and confidence, and highlights the importance of esteem and love in Maslow's hierarchy. Again, it clearly links the knowledge to the scenario and explains why the breakdown of the relationship will have had this impact. Overall, by applying Maslow's hierarchy of needs to the scenario and addressing different levels within the hierarchy, the response effectively explains why the individual is struggling to achieve self-actualisation, making it a strong response to the question and achieving in the top mark band. Outline the biological approach. Compare the biological approach with the psychodynamic approach. There are 16 marks available for the question. So to achieve in the top mark band, so to achieve between 13 and 16 marks, there should be an accurate understanding of the biological approach, and then the comparison with the psychodynamic approach should be comprehensive. There may be some minor details or arguments that are not extended. The response should be clear and focused throughout, and technical language should be used wherever possible. We know for questions like this, different marks will be available for illustrating different skills. So for the first part of this question, outline the biological approach. We know that AO1 knowledge marks will be available. There will be 6 AO1 knowledge marks that can be awarded in this question. For the second element of the question, the comparison, so comparing the biological and psychodynamic approach, 10 marks will be available, and these will be AO3 evaluation and discussion. Here is the model response. AO1 material will be highlighted in blue and AO3 material will be highlighted in pink. The biological approach emphasises the role of genetics, the nervous system, and neurochemistry. The key assumption is that human behaviour and cognition can be explained by physiological factors. Central to this approach is the understanding of biological structures such as the nervous system, which is made up of the brain, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, influencing behaviour through electrical and chemical signals. Genes play a significant role too, influencing behaviour through their effects on both genotype and phenotype, contributing to a genetic basis for certain behaviours and traits. Evolutionary principles also form part of the biological approach, suggesting that behaviours have evolved over time to enhance survival and reproduction. Neurochemistry, particularly the action of neurotransmitters, is also important as they regulate communication within the nervous system and can impact mood, condition, and behaviour. By focusing on these biological mechanisms, the approach aims to understand the physiological factors influencing behaviour and how they interact with environmental factors. The approaches differ on what they think is the cause of behaviour. The biological approach attributes behaviour to innate factors like genetics and neurochemistry and focuses on the impact of nature. It says that genetic predispositions and physiological processes will affect how people behave. In contrast, the psychodynamic approach points to early childhood experiences and unconscious drives being the cause of behaviour, stressing the role of nurture. It focuses on the impact of unconscious conflicts and childhood experiences on psychological development. As a result of this, the two approaches also differ on the treatments that they suggest. The biological approach uses medication to treat psychological disorders by targeting neurotransmitter imbalances or other physiological factors. This is very different to how the psychodynamic approach uses psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, aiming to uncover and resolve unconscious conflicts and childhood traumas through talking and interpretation. While drug therapy directly alters biological processes, psychoanalysis and psychotherapy focus on insight, self-awareness, and resolving internal conflicts. Finally, the biological approach takes a nomothetic perspective, looking for universal laws and general principles that can be applied to all individuals. This is in line with there being biological determinants of behaviour. The psychodynamic approach, however, takes an ideographic approach, looking at the unique individual experiences and understanding specific circumstance. The biological approach looks for overarching patterns, but the psychodynamic approach values the complexity and subjectivity around individuals. The response begins by effectively outlining the biological approach, and so meets the demands of the initial part of the question, outline the biological approach. It explains how the biological approach emphasises genetics, the nervous system and neurochemistry, and highlights its focus on physiological factors in understanding behaviour. The use of technical language here, such as genotype, phenotype and neurotransmitters, adds detail to the description and shows that the approach is really well understood. Remember that there are just 6 AO1 marks available here, so making 4, 5 or 6 statements about the approach is sufficient in order to secure those 6 marks. The response takes every opportunity to show the depth of knowledge. So, for example, when it makes reference to the nervous system, it quickly goes on to say that this is made up of the brain, spinal cord and the peripheral nerves. Again, this is quickly showing a depth of knowledge and wider understanding. Wherever there is this opportunity, add this to the response. We can see this again in the second paragraph, when there is the description of the role of neurotransmitters, and it goes on to say that these can impact mood, cognition and behaviour. Again, this is showing specific ways and specific examples of how neurotransmitters, how the biological approach will impact on emotion and behaviour. In the second part of the question, so in the comparison between the two approaches, this is well structured and is really quite insightful. Rather than simply describing each of the approaches, It selects a specific feature and then contrasts how each approach addresses this. This ensures that it is a focused and meaningful comparison and allows for a deeper understanding of the differences between the two perspectives to be shown. So, for example, in the first comparison paragraph, the characteristic that's selected is the cause of behaviour. So the approaches differ on what they think is the cause of behaviour. It then goes on to say what the biological approach thinks and what the psychodynamic approach thinks. And this allows for direct comparison around that key point, the cause of behaviour. We'll see this then repeated in the second paragraph. And again, the difference is identified, that the treatments that the approaches suggest are different. It then goes on to say what the biological approach suggests in terms of treatment, and then how this differs to the treatments that emerge from the psychodynamic approach. Again, this is not just describing the two approaches. The paragraph is focused around one point and then offers information on both of the approaches. The response finishes with the consideration of the nomothetic and ideographic approaches, and again how each of the approaches does use a different perspective. This is done really well because we can see, for example, in terms of the biological approach, it says that it does take a nomothetic perspective, and this is in line with there being biological determinants of behaviour. So again, it is linked back to the knowledge of the approach and why it would take this nomothetic perspective. So overall, the response shows a good understanding in the first instance of the biological approach, and then it has presented a logical and structured comparison between the two. The response remains focused and clear throughout, and technical language has been used. Section B, Biopsychology. Answer all questions in this section. There are 24 marks available, and in the exam, you should aim to spend around 30 minutes on these questions. Remember that research methods can be examined in all parts of the paper. Briefly outline what is meant by excitation and inhibition in synaptic transmission. There are 2 marks available for the question. We can see from the mark scheme here that to achieve both of these marks, the response should be concise and well structured, and additional details need to be provided. Because this question is looking for 2 definitions, because it's asking what is meant by, we know we can give 2 statements, 2 sentences, each containing a definition. It's not looking for a difference between the 2, it is just looking for the definition and understanding of the 2 concepts. Let's take a look at this model answer. Excitation refers to the process by which a nerve impulse induces the release of neurotransmitters and increases the likelihood of an action potential. Inhibition refers to the process by which neurotransmitters prevent the generation of an action potential. This response is a strong answer to the question, as it provides 2 brief yet accurate definitions of excitation and inhibition in synaptic transmission. By presenting them in different paragraphs, it makes it really obvious as to where both parts of the question have been addressed. Technical language is used, which does add to the level of detail in the response. Terms such as nerve impulse, neurotransmitters, action potential all demonstrate a clear understanding of the topic. Explain the difference between the central and peripheral nervous system. There are 4 marks available for the question. We can see from the mark scheme here that to achieve in the top mark band, so to achieve 3 or 4 marks, the explanation of the difference should be evident and correct, and that there needs to be a clear consideration of both the central and the peripheral nervous system. The answer should have a clear structure, and technical language should be used whenever possible. We should note from the question that it is looking for differences between the 2 nervous systems, and it is not just looking for a description of the 2. We therefore need to pick characteristics or features of the 2 systems and then explain how these are different across the 2 systems. It is really important to use this structure when addressing a comparison question. A description or a definition of the two systems would not be enough and would restrict the marks awarded. Let's take a look at this model response. The two have very different functions. The central nervous system is responsible for processing sensory information and the overall coordination of bodily functions, whereas the peripheral nervous system transmits sensory information to the central nervous system and carries motor commands to muscles and glands. The structure of the two systems is also very different. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cord and is located within the skull and vertebral column, whereas the peripheral nervous system consists of nerves and ganglia outside of the central nervous system, and this extends throughout the rest of the body. The response effectively addresses the question by clearly identifying two distinct differences between the central and peripheral nervous systems, function and then structure. Each difference is presented in a separate paragraph, and this makes the response really well organised. In the first paragraph, the difference in function is explained, that the central nervous system is responsible for processing sensory information and coordinating bodily functions, while the peripheral system transmits sensory information and carries motor commands to muscles and glands. This comparison highlights the functional role of each of the systems. It's important to pay attention to how the comparison has been made. It isn't just given a description of the two systems. It has selected a characteristic, so the function of the systems, and then explained how this is different for the two. This is an effective comparison. In the second paragraph, the structural differences between the two systems has been outlined. The central nervous system consisting of the brain and spinal cord and its location within the skull and vertebral column, whereas the peripheral nervous system is made up of nerves and ganglia outside of the central nervous system and how it extends throughout the rest of the body. Again, it's identified a characteristic, the structure, and explained how this is different for the two systems. You'll note that the two paragraphs are based on two characteristics and not on the two systems. Technical language such as sensory information, motor commands, nerves, all enhance the precision and accuracy of the response. Overall, the response effectively addresses the question by clearly presenting and explaining the differences between the central and peripheral nervous systems. It uses clear organisation and employs appropriate technical language. Outline the role of the endocrine system. There are 2 marks available for the question. We can see from the mark scheme here that to achieve both of these marks, so to achieve 2 marks, the response must be concise, and this is in line with the fact that it is an outline question. It should be well structured and additional details should be provided. As we said, an outline question, brief statements and sentences will be sufficient as long as they are accurate and detailed. And to make sure that additional details are provided, we should identify first the main role and then extend this in some way. Let's take a look at this model answer. The endocrine system produces and releases hormones into the bloodstream, helping to regulate physiological processes. This includes someone's metabolism, immune function, and reproduction. This facilitates communication between cells and allows the body to adapt to changing conditions. The response succinctly outlines the role of the endocrine system by stating that it produces and releases hormones into the bloodstream to regulate physiological processes. This identifies and outlines the key function of the role of the system, and it goes on to provide examples to support this further: metabolism, immune function, and reproduction. It accurately notes that the endocrine system facilitates communication between cells and enables the body to adapt to changing conditions. This offers the additional detail to the response and helps to secure the second mark. Remember that for 2-mark questions like this, a point should be made or a definition should be given, and then it needs to be followed with some expansion and further information. These questions shouldn't take long to complete, but always make sure that you have added in something extra. Recently, an individual suffered a stroke that impacted their ability to speak coherently, as well as impairing movement in the left side of their body. Using your knowledge of localization of function in the brain, Explain why this person may be experiencing these changes. There are 6 marks available for the question. We can see from the mark scheme here that to achieve in the top mark band, so to achieve 5 or 6 marks, understanding of localisation of function in the brain needs to be evident and well explained. So good knowledge needs to be presented, and this needs to be extended wherever possible. And it also states that application to the person should be strong and in depth. So wherever possible, we need to be making reference back to this individual. The answer should be cohesive, so there should be a clear structure and ideas should be linked, and technical language should be used throughout. If we look at the information in the scenario again, we can see that there have been 2 major issues for the individual since their stroke. The first is the impact on their speech, and the second is on their movement in the left side of their body. This offers a clear structure to the response to talk about why, linking back to localisation of function in the brain, these changes and difficulties have occurred. Here is the model response. The individual's impaired movement in the left side of their body may be attributed to damage in the motor area of their brain. This is located at the back of the frontal lobe. This area controls voluntary movement, with damage to the right side of the brain leading to impairments in movement on the left side of the body due to the contralateral organisation of the motor pathways. Their difficulty speaking coherently could stem from damage in Broca's area, situated in the left frontal lobe, which is responsible for speech production. As Broca's area plays a crucial role in language processing, damage to this region may result in Broca's aphasia, which leads someone to have slower speech, difficulties with sounds and words, and reduced fluency. This response effectively addresses the question by providing explanations for the individual's impaired movement and speech coherence, and it attributes these changes to specific brain areas. The answer is well structured, presenting discussions on the motor and language areas of the brain in separate paragraphs, and this enhances the clarity and organisation of the response. In the first paragraph, the explanation links the impaired movement in the left side of the body to damage in the motor area of the brain, situated at the back of the frontal lobe. This gives specific details on the brain area that is responsible for motor movement. Technical language is used here, such as motor area and frontal lobe and contralateral organisation, demonstrating a precise understanding of brain anatomy and function. Similarly, in the second paragraph, the response links to the difficulty speaking coherently to damage in Broca's area, located in the left frontal lobe, which is responsible for speech production. This again shows a really detailed knowledge of localisation of function. By discussing Broca's aphasia, the answer illustrates the consequences of damage to this region and uses technical language like Broca's area and aphasia well. Overall, the response effectively connects the individual's symptoms to specific brain areas, demonstrating an understanding of the localisation of function in the brain and its implications for the individual's condition. Outline 2 problems with using post-mortem examinations to study the brain. There are 2 marks available for the question. The question is asking for an outline, so we know that statements and brief sentences will be sufficient. And it is asking for 2 problems. We know therefore that each problem can be presented in a simple statement or sentence. The focus needs to be on the use of post-mortem examinations, and there should be a clear link back to how this helps us investigate and study the brain. Here is the model response. One problem is causation. The brain damage observed might not be linked to what is being studied and could be due to some other unknown condition. They also lack dynamic information about brain functioning, as no brain activity can be recorded or measured. This response effectively addresses the question by outlining 2 problems associated with using post-mortem examinations to study the brain. Each problem is presented succinctly in a brief point, and this really enhances the clarity and conciseness of the answer. For a 2-mark question like this, when 2 points need to be provided, brief statements and sentences are sufficient. Just make sure that your knowledge is communicated well. The first limitation mentioned is the issue of causation, where the observed brain damage may not necessarily be linked to the specific condition being studied, but actually could be attributed to other unknown factors. This point highlights a fundamental challenge in drawing direct causal relationships from post-mortem findings. In the second paragraph, it identifies another limitation, which is a lack of dynamic information about brain functioning. By noting that post-mortem examinations do not provide real-time data on brain activity, the answer highlights the inherent limitation in studying brain function and dynamics through this method. By presenting the information in two different paragraphs, it makes it really clear where two different limitations are being presented. Always make it obvious where you are meeting the demands of the question. So overall, the response effectively addresses the question by presenting two clear limitations of using post-mortem examinations to study the brain, and demonstrates an understanding of the challenges associated with this approach.
Discuss research into circadian rhythms. There are 8 marks available from the question. We can see from the mark scheme here that to achieve in the top mark band, so to achieve 7 or 8 marks, the understanding of research into circadian rhythms should be evident and well explained, so there needs to be lots of accurate subject knowledge, and this needs to be presented in detail. There needs to be a discussion or an evaluation of the research, and again this should be strong and in-depth, so again lots of detail is needed. The answer should be cohesive, so there needs to be a clear and obvious structure, and technical language should be used throughout. Because this is a discuss question, we know that both AO1 knowledge and AO3 evaluation marks will be available. There will be 4 marks of AO1 knowledge and there will be 4 marks of AO3 evaluation. This question is specifically asking you to discuss research into circadian rhythms, and it's important to note here what this actually means. This is not limited to individual research studies on circadian rhythms. Theories and explanations of circadian rhythms will also be creditworthy. So please always take this into account when you see a question about research. This can be studies and theory. Let's take a look at this model response. AO1 material will be highlighted in blue and AO3 material will be highlighted in pink. Seif's cave study 1965 investigated the effects of prolonged isolation on circadian rhythms. Seif spent 2 months isolated in a cave with no exogenous zeitgebers. His sleep patterns, cognitive functioning and psychological state were monitored. His sleep-wake cycle changed to 25 hours and he struggled to maintain his mood. When he left the cave, he thought only 1 month had passed. He concluded that it was hard to control circadian rhythms without any exogenous zeitgebers. Folkard et al. 1985 conducted a similar study and 12 people lived in a cave for 3 weeks. Participants were subjected to a manipulated 22-hour day. They struggled to adapt and their circadian rhythms remained close to the natural 24-hour day. This shows endogenous pacemakers do play a powerful role in maintaining circadian rhythms. This research has real-life applications, such as the difficulties with shift work. Boivin et al. 1996 looked at how optimising shift patterns could reduce disruptions to circadian rhythms and lead to improved worker productivity and safety. This shows the practical significance of circadian rhythm research and how it can help organisations be more economical and efficient. However, a lot of the research has been done in sleep laboratories and artificial situations, like living in a cave. These controlled environments may lack ecological validity, as participant experience in a lab setting may not accurately reflect their behaviour in real life. The findings from these studies may have limited generalisability to everyday situations, questioning the applicability of the results beyond the lab setting. The research is also comprised of small groups or individual participants. This will again limit the generalisability of the findings to broader populations, as individual differences in circadian rhythms may not be considered. Applying the results from small samples to larger populations should be avoided, and there is a need for more representative samples in future research. The response provides a thorough discussion of 2 key research studies into circadian rhythms, demonstrating a good understanding of the topic. The inclusion of Seif's case study 1965 and Folkard et al. 1985's research provides specific examples to support the discussion. There is good detail included of each of these research studies. It talks about the amount of time that participants were isolated, and it talks about the specific length of circadian rhythms. Always consider the aim, procedure, findings and conclusion structure when talking about a study in a response. This will help you to make sure that you are getting the right amount of detail into a response. You don't need to use this as a rigid framework. You don't need to include statements such as the aim was, the procedure was, but just use it as a checklist to get the required detail in there. The evaluative material presented in the response is also well structured, with strengths and limitations being clearly identified. Each of the evaluative paragraphs follows a point, explain and consequence structure, which really does help to increase the clarity and coherence of the work. For example, the paragraph discussing the real-life applications of circadian rhythm firstly identifies the area in which the research can be applied to shift work, so the point is identified. It goes on to explain this point by presenting the work of Boivin et al. 1996 and explaining how the research was used to improve shift patterns and to reduce disruptions. And then the final sentence gives the consequence. It explains how the research has value and how it has helped organisations become more economical and efficient. In the second evaluative paragraph, where it highlights a limitation, again it uses a point, explain, consequence structure. The point is firstly identified, that the research has been carried out in sleep labs and artificial settings, and it then does a link back to the Seif and Folkard research by acknowledging that this has mostly been done by participants living in a cave. It explains this, that these are controlled environments that may lack ecological validity, and how participant experience will differ greatly between the two. It then finishes the evaluative point by discussing the consequence, that as a result of this and this low level of ecological validity, it also leads to limited generalisability. In the final evaluation paragraph, we see this structure again. The point is identified, that the research has been made up of small groups or individual participants. The sample size has been small. It explains this by talking about how individual differences in circadian rhythms may not be recognised, and therefore the consequence of this is that larger populations and larger samples are needed, and the results will not be able to be applied to wider populations. Technical language has been used appropriately throughout the response, such as circadian rhythms, exogenous Zeitgebers and endogenous pacemakers, and these all demonstrate a strong grasp of the subject. For example, the description of Seif's study highlights the manipulation of exogenous Zeitgebers and the impact on his circadian rhythms, and this shows a good use of technical language. So overall, the response offers a comprehensive discussion of research into circadian rhythms, and it's supported by specific examples and a structured evaluation. The inclusion of technical language and evaluative points really enhance the depth and quality of the response, making it a strong and effective answer to the question. Section C, Research Methods. Answer all the questions in this section. There are 48 marks available, and in the exam you should aim to spend around 60 minutes, so 1 hour, on these questions. The next set of questions are all focused around this research scenario. Always take the time to fully read and understand the information that is being presented. A university psychology department placed an advert on their social media page asking for participants to take part in a new study looking at demands in the workplace. 150 participants were placed in a simulation of a customer service work environment.
They worked in a virtual environment responding to customer complaints via the live chat facility. Participants were assigned to one of two groups. Participants in condition A, high demand, were met with challenging complaints from very angry customers. Participants in condition B, low demand, were met with issues that could be resolved easily and the customers were cooperative. After the simulation, participants were given the opportunity to walk on a treadmill or sit and watch television during the break period. The amount of time on the treadmill and watching television was measured. Whilst reading through the information, you should start to pick out potential questions that could be asked. The scenario starts by telling us how the participants were recruited, that an advert was placed on the social media page asking for participants to take part. This tells us that a volunteer sampling method was used. The participants volunteered themselves to take part in the study. It then goes on to tell us about the two conditions, so condition A and condition B, either high demand or low demand. This information could lend itself to a question about experimental design and the conditions in which the participants took part, or it could also lend itself to a question about variables or a hypothesis, as this is clearly giving us information about the independent variable and the variable which the researchers controlled and manipulated or changed. We find out later in the description that it was the amount of time on the treadmill and watching television that was measured. So we know this is the information that the researchers wanted to measure and record, the dependent variable. And again, this information could be included in a response to a question about the variables, identifying the dependent variable, or again, it could be information that would need to be included in a hypothesis. It is always worth spending time at the beginning of this section, reading and fully understanding the research scenario. Throughout the questions in this section, you will need to use and apply this information. This is much quicker and easier if you are familiar with the scenario, if you know where that information is, and have already considered the questions that could be asked. The first question asks you to state the aim of this study, and just 1 mark is available. This means that a brief statement or sentence showing the aim of the study is sufficient. The response to this question could therefore be to investigate whether work demands affect physical energy levels. A brief, simple sentence like this is the perfect response to this question. No more is needed. But remember that this can only be done when you have spent the time familiarising yourself with the overview of the research study. It really is worth investing that time to make sure that you can answer questions like this easily. Remember that a research aim is a general statement about what is to be investigated and an outline of the general purpose and focus of the study. Always start an aim with the phrase to investigate or the aim is to investigate. Identify the sampling method used in this study. Shade 1 box only. Option A, random sampling. Option B, volunteer sampling. Option C, opportunity sampling. And option D, stratified sampling. You will recognise each of these sampling methods, and they will all have been methods that you have studied during the course. There is therefore no way to immediately rule out any of the options. This does rely on you being able to recall your knowledge of the different sampling methods and apply this to the research scenario. Again, this clearly shows why spending that time understanding the study is really, really important. From our earlier analysis, we have already identified the sampling method, so this question should be really quick and easy to respond to. The correct answer is B, volunteer sampling. Volunteer sampling is the method in which the participants self-select to be part of the study. In this scenario, we know the university psychology department placed an advert on their social media page asking for participants to take part in the study. Interested individuals will then voluntarily choose to participate, hence its name volunteer sampling. Option A, random sampling, this is incorrect. This is where each person has an equal chance of being selected to take part in a study. In this study, the participants were not randomly selected, but rather self-selected by responding to the advert. Option C, opportunity sampling, is also incorrect. This method involves participants who are readily available or convenient to the researcher. While participants in this study may have been conveniently accessible through the university's social media page, they still had to actively volunteer to participate. And finally, option D, stratified sampling, this is also incorrect. This method involves dividing the population into subgroups and then selecting participants from each subgroup in proportion to the population. There is no indication in the scenario that participants were selected in this way. Outline what is meant by a pilot study. Explain why it would have been useful for a pilot study to be carried out for this study. There are 3 marks available for the question. We can see from the mark scheme that the first mark will be awarded for an accurate definition of a pilot study, and this corresponds with the first part of the question, outline what is meant by a pilot study. So here we just need to give a clear sentence providing a definition. The mark scheme then goes on to say that an additional 2 marks will be awarded for a well-explained reason and a clear application to the study, and this addresses the second part of the question. Explain why it would have been useful for this particular study. So we need to make sure that both elements of the question are being addressed. We can tick each off as we include the relevant information in the response. So outline, give a definition of a pilot study, and explain why it would be really useful in this particular scenario. Let's take a look at this model response. A pilot study is a small-scale preliminary investigation conducted before the main research takes place to assess the feasibility, methods, and potential challenges of the study. In this study, a pilot study would have helped to identify if any changes needed to be made. For example, it would have looked at the level of the demand in both conditions to look at whether there was a big enough difference between the two, or if one of the tasks was too simple or too challenging. Changes could then have been made to the tasks, which would have increased the success of the final study. The response begins by giving a really clear definition of what a pilot study is and what it includes. It says that it's a small-scale study taking place before the main piece of research, and that it is used to assess the feasibility, the methods, and any potential challenges that could be faced. This secures the first mark by giving a clear definition and shows a good understanding of the purpose of a pilot study. The answer then directly links this information to the research study in question by explaining how a pilot study would have been useful. It highlights the importance of identifying any necessary changes that may be needed before conducting the main study, so there is a clear link back to the definition. Specifically, it mentions looking at the demand of the task in both of the conditions and whether the tasks were appropriately calibrated in terms of difficulty. This demonstrates an understanding of how a pilot study can help refine and really optimise the design of a study and make sure that it is effective. It also shows a clear understanding of the current research context as knowledge has been successfully applied. Again, this shows the need to keep revisiting the research scenario and make links whenever you possibly can. Finally, the response finishes by outlining the action that would be taken as a result of the pilot study. It suggests that changes could have been made to the tasks based on the findings of the pilot study, ultimately increasing the success of the final piece of work. This demonstrates insight into the practical implications of conducting a pilot study and how it can lead to improvements in the overall research process. This provides the necessary depth and exploration that is needed to secure that second mark in the second element of the question. As a result of there not being a pilot study, the researcher was concerned about investigator effects and demand characteristics. Explain the difference between investigator effects and demand characteristics. There are 2 marks available for the question. The mark scheme says that to gain the 2 marks, the answer should be well defined and there should be a detailed explanation of the difference between investigator effects and demand characteristics. We therefore need to make sure that any knowledge presented is accurate
and that additional detail and explanation is given, and there needs to be a clear comparison and an explanation of the difference between the two concepts. Here is the model response. Investigator effects originate from unintentional cues or biases introduced by the researcher, whereas demand characteristics arise from features within the experimental design or context that influence participant behaviour. The response effectively addresses the question by providing a clear and concise comparison between investigator effects and demand characteristics. The answer uses a comparative approach by directly contrasting investigator effects and demand characteristics. It focuses on where the effects come from and explains this for both. It doesn't just give a definition of the two concepts. This is important for a comparison or an explain the difference question. The language used in the response is technical but still really accessible. So for example, unintentional cues and biases, they're used in an appropriate and an accurate way, and they add clarity to the response. Overall, the response effectively communicates the difference between the two key terms by using a comparative approach, clear language and a concise structure. For a short 2-mark question such as this, the response is sufficient as both concepts have been clearly addressed. Suggest 2 things that can be done to prevent demand characteristics. There are just 2 marks available for the question. For a question like this, there is no need to give it any further extension or elaboration of how or why these actions could prevent and contribute to the reduction of demand characteristics. It is just asking for 2 things that could be done. So 2 statements, 2 brief sentences is absolutely enough. The response is a good answer to the question because it provides 2 practical strategies for preventing demand characteristics in research studies. As mentioned before, the question is a suggest question and there are just 2 marks available, so brief statements like this are sufficient. Firstly, it suggests that using a double-blind design could reduce demand characteristics, and this is a well-established method in research to minimise any sort of bias by ensuring that neither the participants nor the researchers know the experimental conditions. It helps to eliminate the potential for any sort of unintentional cue or bias influencing participant behaviour. Secondly, the response suggests deceiving participants and hiding the aim of the experiment. While this approach raises ethical considerations and may not be suitable for all research contexts, it can effectively prevent participants from altering their behaviour based on their perceptions of the study's purpose. Participants should always be fully debriefed afterwards. So overall, the response offers 2 clear and relevant strategies for preventing demand characteristics, demonstrated a good understanding of how to mitigate potential biases in research studies. Write a suitable directional hypothesis for this study. There are 3 marks available for the question. We know that for a hypothesis to be full and complete, both the independent and the dependent variables need to be clear and they need to be fully operationalised. Also, because the question is asking for a directional hypothesis, we know that there needs to be a directional prediction about the results. This is clearly identified in the mark scheme as well, where it says that there should be a clear direction. So a suitable directional hypothesis here could be participants exposed to high demand work conditions, condition A, will spend significantly less time on the treadmill during the break period compared to participants exposed to low demand work conditions, condition B. This statement represents a fully operationalised directional hypothesis because it clearly specifies the variables involved, the predicted direction of the effect and how it will be measured. Firstly, it identifies the independent variable, so work conditions, which are operationalised as high demand conditions, condition A, and low demand conditions, condition B. This provides clarity on what participants will experience in each of the conditions. Secondly, it outlines the dependent variable, the amount of time spent on the treadmill during the break period.
and this indicates how the effect of the independent variable will be measured and observed. Finally, the hypothesis makes a directional prediction. Participants exposed to high demand work conditions will spend significantly less time on the treadmill compared to participants exposed to low demand work conditions. This demonstrates a clear expectation of the impact that the independent variable will have on the dependent variable. So overall, the hypothesis is fully operationalised as it precisely defines the variables, it predicts the direction of the effect, and it specifies how the effect will be measured. Identify 2 sections that appear in a scientific report. There are 2 marks available for the question. As this is an identify question and there are just 2 marks available, 2 bullet-pointed responses are absolutely sufficient. We can see from the response here that 2 sections from a scientific report have been identified. The abstract and then the introduction. 2 simple bullet points identifying the title of each of these sections is enough to secure the 2 marks. Other answers and other sections of a scientific report that could have been included here are the method, results, discussion, and referencing. Select one of the sections identified in question 17. Describe what would be included in this section of the scientific report. There are 3 marks available for the question. It's important to note here that this question is asking you to refer back to the previous question, question 17, and to select one of the sections that you recorded in that response. This shows why it is important to read ahead and be aware of upcoming questions. Your response to question 17 may be different if you want to focus on a particular part of the scientific report in this question. There are 3 marks available for the question. 1 mark is awarded for each piece of information that may be included within that section of the report. Here is the example answer. In the introduction section of a research paper, relevant background information is given to show the context of the research and how it addresses a gap in the area. It will outline the aim of the study and to give a clear statement of the hypothesis. It will also explain why the piece of research will be significant and the contribution it will make. The answer provides a good response to the question because it clearly identifies and describes the content that would be included in the introduction section of a scientific report. The introduction was a section of a scientific paper that was identified in question 17. Firstly, it mentions that the introduction provides relevant background information to establish the context of the research, and this demonstrates an understanding of the purpose of the introduction in setting the stage for the study. Secondly, the answer correctly states that the introduction outlines the aim of the study and will present a clear statement of the hypothesis. This highlights the importance of defining the research objectives and hypotheses at the beginning of a paper. Finally, the response explains that the introduction will include a statement around the importance of the study and its potential impact on advancing knowledge in the area. Overall, the answer effectively addresses the question by providing an overview of the content typically included in the introduction section of a scientific report. When comparing the data for the 2 conditions, the psychologist found that there was a difference in the amount of time spent on the treadmill after the work simulation. This is shown in Table 1. From the table, we can see the mean number of minutes spent on the treadmill for both Condition A, high demand work experience, and Condition B, low demand work experience. The mean number of minutes spent on the treadmill in Condition A was 7.8, and the mean number of minutes spent on the treadmill from Condition B was 15.6. The question then asks you to draw a suitable graphical display to represent the data in Table 1, and that you should label your graph appropriately. There are 4 marks available for the question. The mark scheme is very clear here about how the 4 marks will be awarded. And this mark scheme is consistent across all questions that ask you to draw a graph
The first mark will be awarded for including a title with reference to both the independent variable and the dependent variable. A second mark will be awarded for the correct plotting of data onto the graph. And the marks will be awarded for the correct labelling of the axes. You should always make sure that you work through these steps, title, axes, data, to make sure that all marks can be awarded. So firstly, a title will be included. So this could be a graph to show a difference between the mean number of minutes spent on a treadmill after a high demand work experience and a low demand work experience. This clearly refers to both the independent variable and the dependent variable. It includes reference to what is measured, the dependent variable, and this is the mean number of minutes spent on the treadmill. The independent variable is also referred to, and this being the high demand work experience or the low demand work experience. The next stage will then be to label the axes. So along the horizontal axes, we will put the two conditions, and this will represent the independent variable, high demand or low demand. And then on the vertical axis, we will put in the dependent variable, the mean time spent on physical activity, the mean amount of time spent on the treadmill. The data is then accurately taken from table 1 and plotted onto the graph. The full marks could be awarded for this response because it has a clear and appropriate title that includes reference to both the IV and the DV. Labels have been given to the axes and the data has been plotted accurately.
What do the mean values in Table 1 suggest about physical activity levels? Give a clear reason for your conclusion. And there are 2 marks available for the question. The mark scheme is very clear here and guides us to how both of these marks can be awarded. Firstly, 1 mark will be given for a correct interpretation of the mean and the impact of work demands on physical activity. And then the second mark, so an additional mark, will be given for the correct reason for the conclusion. Here is the model response. People carry out less physical activity after carrying out highly demanding work than after carrying out less demanding work. This is because the mean time spent on the treadmill and taking part in physical activity is lower in condition A, 7.8 minutes, than in condition B, 15.6 minutes. This is a good answer to the question because it provides a clear interpretation of the mean values presented in Table 1 regarding physical activity levels. Firstly, the answer effectively summarises the main finding indicated by the mean values, that people engage in less physical activity after performing highly demanding work compared to less demanding work. This demonstrates an understanding of the relationship between the independent variable, work demands, and the dependent variable, physical activity levels. Secondly, and to secure the second mark, the response supports the conclusion by referencing specific mean values from Table 1. It highlights that the mean time spent on the treadmill in condition A, 7.8 minutes, is lower than in condition B, 15.6 minutes, providing quantitative evidence to support the interpretation. So overall, the answer provides a concise and really logical interpretation of the mean values from Table 1 and demonstrates an understanding of how to draw conclusions based on the data presented. The researcher decided to calculate the standard deviation. Outline what is meant by the standard deviation and explain why it would be useful in understanding the findings. There are 2 marks available for the question. We need to be very careful here because there are 2 very different parts of the question. So the first mark says it will be awarded for addressing the first part of the question, so outlining what is meant by standard deviation. And we need to give an accurate definition of this. The second mark will be awarded for addressing the second part of the question, so for explaining why it would be useful in this study. What would the standard deviation tell us? Here is the model response. Standard deviation refers to the amount of variation or dispersion in a set of data points from the mean. In this study, it would allow the researcher to understand the spread of values around the mean assess the variability within the data and the individual differences in the physical activity levels. This response is a good answer to the question because it provides a clear definition of standard deviation and then goes on to explain its usefulness in understanding the findings of the study. So in the first sentence, the answer effectively defines standard deviation as the amount of variation or dispersion in a set of data points from the mean. This definition clearly explains the concept of standard deviation and makes it clear that it is understood. The answer then goes on to explain why standard deviation would be useful in understanding the findings of this study. It highlights that calculating the standard deviation would allow the researcher to understand the spread of values around the mean, would assess the variability within the data, and consider any individual differences. This shows a good understanding of how standard deviation can provide an insight into the distribution and variability of data points within the dataset of the current study. A clear link has been made here to the research scenario, and this ensures that the second part of the question has been fully addressed. Always make sure that all aspects of the question have been understood. It is easy to miss parts in questions like this. Tick them off once you have done. Explain 2 economic implications of this research. There are 4 marks available for the question. We can see from the mark scheme here that it says to achieve in the top mark band, so to achieve 3 or 4 marks, the explanation should be evident and correct. So there needs to be a clear explanation of the 2 economic implications, and this should be detailed. And clear application of the research needs to be made to the economy. The answer should have a clear structure, and technical language should be used throughout. So let's unpick the question a little more. Because it is an explain question, we know that points need to be made and then these need to be extended and elaborated on in some way, given an additional detail, given a reason why the economic implication occurs. Because the question is looking for 2 economic implications, we should use this to guide the structure of the response and make sure that information is presented in 2 very different paragraphs. And then finally, we can see that the question is particularly focused on economic implications. So this is looking at the financial consequences of the research for organisations and society as a whole. Here is the model response. 1 economic implication is the potential impact on staff emotional well-being and physical health. If work has been demanding and staff carry out less physical activity, they may experience high levels of stress, leading to increased absenteeism and lateness to work. This can result in high costs and the need for additional resources to cover for absent or late employees. It may also lead to a high staff turnover and increased training needs. If work is demanding and this results in less physical energy, people may decide to leave their job and seek alternative, less demanding employment. This means that newer, potentially less experienced staff will be recruited. Training these staff will cost both time and money. This response provides a thorough explanation of the economic implications of the research. It identifies 2 implications, and these are addressed in 2 distinct paragraphs, and this makes the answer very organised and easy to read. Firstly, it identifies the potential impact on staff emotional well-being and physical health, pointing out that demanding work conditions may lead to increased stress levels amongst employees and subsequently resulting in higher rates of absenteeism and lateness. Drawing this connection between work demands and the employees' well-being directly does affect businesses, as the need for additional resources to cover for these missing employees will increase. So where the implication has been identified in the opening sentence, it then goes on to be explained in the second sentence. The impact has been identified and then it is explained. So make the point and then expand upon it. This really helps to achieve that required depth and detail needed to reach the top mark band. So we can see it's been identified, impact on staff emotional well-being, and then extended by saying the consequence, the result. The result is high costs and the need for additional resources. The answer then looks at the issue of high staff turnover and increased training needs, and the second implication is identified at the start of the second sentence. High staff turnover and increased training needs. Again, it then goes on to explain what this implication is and the impact that it will have. It explains that if demanding work conditions carry on, employees may opt to leave their current job in search of less stressful alternatives. By outlining these two potential outcomes or implications, the answer really does effectively demonstrate how the findings of the research could have significant economic implications for businesses. And so it makes it a strong and thorough answer to the question. It's really clearly organised and both of the points have been fully extended. Identify an appropriate statistical test that could be used to analyse the data in this study. Give 3 clear reasons for the decision. There are 7 marks available for the question. The first mark will be awarded for the first part of the question, for appropriately identifying the statistical test that should be used. Just a brief statement, just including the name of the test, will be enough to secure that mark. The question then asks for 3 clear reasons. And for each of these reasons, 2 marks will be available. And this will then lead to the remaining 6 marks being awarded. So there will be 2 marks per reason. Identify the reason and then link it to the study. When deciding on which statistical test to use, there are 3 things that you always need to consider. And these will always give you the structure for questions like this and the 3 clear reasons. You should firstly consider whether it needs to be a test of difference or a test of association. You then need to consider the experimental design that was used in the study. And then finally, you need to consider the level of data that was collected. These are always the 3 things you should consider when selecting an appropriate statistical test, and therefore there will always be the 3 reasons for choosing that test. So a question like this, always work through those same 3 steps. Difference or association, experimental design, and then level of data. Here is the model response. Related t-test. This is an appropriate test because the study is testing a difference between the 2 conditions. The physical activity levels after a high demand work experience compared to a low demand work experience. It is also appropriate as the experiment uses an independent groups design. The participants take part in just one of the conditions, either a high demand work experience or a low demand work experience. Finally, the test is appropriate because it gathers interval level data. This is because it is the time spent on the treadmill during the break time. Time is measured on a numerical scale that has units which are equal and defined. The response starts by identifying the appropriate test, the related t-test. It doesn't need to be anything more than this, simply stating the test is enough. This will secure the first mark. The explanation and reasons for this choice is what will come next. The answer is separated into 3 different paragraphs, 1 for each of the reasons. This makes the answer very organised and very clear to see where the 3 reasons have been presented. Firstly, the response clearly identifies the nature of the statistical test required by outlining the study's objective of analysing the difference between physical activity levels after high demand versus low demand work experiences. And this clearly aligns with the purpose of a related t-test, which is designed to compare the means of 2 related groups or conditions. It is therefore suitable for evaluating differences within the same participants across different conditions. A clear link has then been made to the study and there is reference to the 2 conditions. Remember to extend the point by linking it to the study and do this whenever you possibly can. Secondly, the choice of a related t-test is justified by the experimental design used in the study.
The answer accurately identifies the independent groups design that was used, where participants were assigned to either the high demand or the low demand work experience condition. This design makes sure that the groups being compared are independent of each other. And again, this is a requirement for the related t-test, because it is looking at those differences across the conditions. Finally, the appropriateness of the t-test is justified by the level of data collected in the study. So the response correctly points out that the data gathered is the time spent on the treadmill during the break time, which constitutes interval level data. Again, this has been selected from the scenario and clearly communicated. Keep going back to the overview of the study. Interval level data involves numerical measurements with equal and defined units, allowing for meaningful statistical comparisons. So given that the related t-test is suited for analysing interval level data, its selection in this scenario is correct. So overall, the response demonstrates real clarity and coherence in its explanation, and it links each aspect of the research scenario to the appropriateness of the chosen test. By addressing the type of test required, difference or association, the experimental design, and the level of the data collected, the answer provides a thorough rationale for the decision. So again, when having to select an appropriate statistical test, work through those same 3 steps. Is it a test of difference or association? What is the experimental design? And what is the level of data? A principal of a sixth form college read the researchers' work on levels of demand and physical activity. This made them wonder whether the amount of control students have over their work schedules could impact levels of motivation. The college decided to carry out their own research to find out. Design the investigation into control of work schedules and levels of motivation. Should include information on the sampling method to be used, data collected through a self-report method, and dealing with one ethical issue. Clear reason should be given for all design decisions made. There are 12 marks available for the question. We can see the mark scheme here, and it says that to achieve in the top mark band, so to achieve between 10 and 12 marks, clear design decisions should be evident, so should be clear and are well explained. So for every decision you make about the study, you must give a clear reason. Why have you chosen to do this? Why is that useful or appropriate for studying the impact of control of work schedules? It says that the 3 requirements are addressed and reasons given for the decisions are strong and in-depth. So the 3 requirements link to the 3 bullet points. For the design a study question such as this, there will always be a very clear list of the stages and sections that need to be included. Work through one by one to make sure that you have addressed each of them thoroughly. It says that the answer should be cohesive, so there needs to be a clear structure. And again, working through each of the bullet points in turn will really help you with this. And finally, technical language should be used throughout and always in an accurate way, because this is clearly looking for research methods knowledge. Always consider those technical pieces of language and concepts that you can include that will show off and signpost your understanding of research methods and of experimental design. Here is a model response. Sampling. Volunteer sampling would be appropriate given the context of a sixth form college. A poster could be displayed in the college or a message sent out electronically, email or message board. This method allows for interested participants to volunteer for the study, meaning they are motivated to participate and are more likely to provide meaningful data. Because the study involves students' perceptions of their own motivation, it's important to have participants who are genuinely interested and willing to engage with the research topic. This would also be relatively quick and an easy way to recruit the participants. Data. To collect data on levels of motivation and perceptions of control, a questionnaire could be used. This would mean standardised questions are used that would collect consistent data and allow for easy analysis. Quantitative data would be collected. The structured questionnaire will directly address the research question by asking about students' perceptions of their control over their work schedules and how this relates to their motivation levels.
Questions will be carefully written to find out about control and motivation without leading or biasing responses. The questionnaire could include Likert scale questions to measure the extent of control over work schedules and levels of motivation, providing numerical data that can be analysed statistically. An electronic questionnaire would be sent to students via email or an online platform. The researchers would need to make sure that they didn't include any leading questions, and this could be checked by conducting a pilot study. Changes could then be made before the final questionnaire was distributed. Ethics. One ethical consideration that should be made is around maintaining privacy and confidentiality. Action will be taken to ensure that all data collected remains confidential. The questionnaire should be done in a way that the participants remain anonymous. This would be important as students might share information about how they feel about their study habits or if they are struggling in some way. This is particularly sensitive data. There would be no need to know which student the questionnaire belonged to. This would be made easier if the questionnaire was completed electronically. Participants should be assured that their responses will be kept private. Data will be combined for analysis so individual responses couldn't be identified, and only the researchers will have access to the individual data. If any personal information was collected, it should be securely stored and only used for research purposes. The response clearly meets the requirements of the question. Each requirement, so each of the 3 bullet points, has been clearly addressed under separate subheadings, making it really easy to follow the structure of the response. The response begins with a discussion on the sampling method, followed by data collection methods, and then concludes with ethical considerations. There have been really clear reasons for the design choices. So the response provides clear reasons for each of the design choices that has been made in the investigation. So, for example, in selecting volunteer sampling, the response emphasises the importance of having motivated participants who would be genuinely interested in the research topic. It also notes the context, the situation, the setting of where the research is being carried out within a sixth form college, and how putting out a poster, either in person or electronically, would be a very quick and easy way of recruiting participants. Similarly, in choosing a structured questionnaire for the data collection, the response highlights the benefits of this standardised system for consistent data collection and easy analysis. So again, a design decision has been made, but then a clear reason as to why that would be useful or beneficial has been provided. There is consistent consideration of the research scenario. So throughout the response, the context of the scenario and research has been carefully considered. So for instance, in discussing the sampling method, the response, as we said, specifically mentions the context of a sixth form college and the potential for electronic communication with the students. And again, this is demonstrating an understanding of the unique environment in which the research will take place. This is mentioned again during the data collection section, where it talks about how the questionnaire could be distributed to students and how this could be sent out electronically. It also links this to how this would help with the ethical considerations, that this would make it easier for the information to be kept private and confidential. Research methods technical language has been used throughout the response, and this has included things like volunteer sampling, so the specific sampling method, a structured questionnaire, and terms like maintaining privacy and confidentiality. So there is direct reference to well-known and well-discussed ethical issues. So overall, the response sits within the top mark band. Clear design decisions have been made. They've been identified, and we can see from the examples here, it follows with very clear reasons why these decisions are being made and why it would help the current research. The 3 requirements are addressed, and this has been done well by presenting them in different paragraphs with very clear subheadings. There is no doubt about where each of those points have been addressed in the question. This gives it a very, very clear structure. Finally, research methods technical language has been used throughout the response and is used in an appropriate way that adds real value to the answer.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I have unexplained scratches.